everyone. We are delighted to be here today and to talk to you about your stakeholders and ways that they are probably considering how they think about your products based upon stakeholders within their organizations that have outsized influence rather, and how they think about your products and services, both now and in the future. And so I am delighted to be here today. I'm LouAnn Conner, the founder of SagaciousThink, an advisory firm that helps growth stage startups on their transformation from global expansion to operations optimization and preparing for exits. And I also, as part of that, work with companies around corporate governance. And that includes working with the C-level teams within the companies as well as the boards. And I am delighted to be here today with Svetlana Kamyshanskaya, who is the founder of Primum Law Group and is a seasoned startup advisor with deep expertise in AI regulations, intellectual property, and scaling AI-driven businesses. She provides strategic legal counsel, guiding AI startup founders in making informed decisions. I'm equally excited to have Ben Roome on the panel here with me today, who is a co-founder and consultant at Ethical Resolve, a consultancy that specializes in the ethics of AI and machine learning. Ethical Resolve has helped large companies, startups, investors, and educational organizations. Ben and his partner help his clients implement governance practices that scale as AI transformation progresses. So we're going to focus on companies and their adoption of AI, which, as you know, is all over the map, and especially when you take it from an international perspective. But what can get overlooked with all the focus on AI use cases, cost savings, the latest valuation of AI companies, is how your target companies are looking at AI and how that may be evolving. And within those organizations are specifically critical stakeholders, and that includes the board of directors and departments such as legal and compliance. And before we continue, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So I'm just going to go through a couple of definitions here. One is corporate governance. And so when I say corporate governance, most times people will respond with board of directors. And for the purposes of that conversation, that is absolutely correct. And corporate governance is looking at how to make sure that a company is operating as optimally and as ethically as possible. AI ethics are the principles and standards that guide the development and use of AI to ensure that it is safe, fair, transparent, accountable, and beneficial. So with that, we'll start with corporate governance. Boards of directors have an incredible amount on their plates, from risk to corporate culture. And now we're layering in AI and all the implications that that brings. And so that includes focus on areas like products, supply chain, HR, the list goes on. And then you've got to layer on top of that or pile on the threats involved, such as geopolitics, tariffs, business resiliency. So these individuals have a lot to consider. On top of all of that, there is a personal risk involved for these board directors with respect to AI. For example, in the US, pension funds are now targeting directors over AI oversight failings across the political spectrum, from California to Florida. Some, such as these funds, believe that AI risk management is underdeveloped, especially when compared to the hype, investment, and adoption of AI technology. And that is a worry to these stakeholders. And aside from risks, boards are focused on how do we ensure that this technology marries with the organization's core purpose and values? How do we align the use of AI with the company's strategy? And where should we invest and prioritize our efforts? AI is going to change our 5-year forecast. It just is. So how do we ensure that our strategy accommodates these changes? And so that's just the tip of the iceberg from a corporate governance perspective. So Svetlana and Ben, from where you're sitting and with who you're working with, you've got your own purviews or perspective, and specifically Svetlana, you just got back from spending a lot of time in Europe. So I'd be really interested to hear your perspective.
Thank you. Sure. Just before this panel, I attended the panel on the main stage, and they discussed global perspective on AI and from investor standpoint. And taking my experience in Europe and what I've heard, I kind of want to bring that mix of opinions. So some investors believe that we are still at the era when we build the global companies and it's just so convenient and the business model works well. That's why we're still looking at the companies like Google, Apple, like on a global scale, because it just works and it brings profit. And other investors said, oh no, it's not going to work because we have political issues, political risks, infrastructures on a different level in different countries, and we have different regulations.
Right.
And on top of that, like I'm more inclined to be with that second person, so I don't see us building global companies because it just makes financial sense, because there are so many other components and considerations in place that we cannot just ignore. And on top of that, I want to say, yes, I spent a lot of time in Europe, like I've been a month in Europe, and I spoke with different investors and companies, and it looks like there's so much behind in Europe. So now we are saying, and you just said, LouAnn, AI is everywhere, it is changing our life. So one of the questions I received in Germany, oh, when AI is gonna come and be commercialized? So, and I was kind of really, like, I feel like it's around,
here.
you know?
Right.
And I don't know, probably a lot of people know, Europe adopted a new AI Act last year, which really imposed a lot of restrictions.
Right.
And now European market was conservative. It became more difficult to penetrate because of the regulations. It became more difficult to penetrate for foreign companies, and we know the story about Facebook that like was on hold for 6 months. So Europe is kind of very different right now in terms of AI development compared to the US. And to support that point, recently, like a couple of days ago, I was talking to my client who is about to launch AI product, and I said, what market are you planning to go to? And he said, oh, only US, God forbid I go to Europe. So
Wow.
basically, early stage companies right now don't see, they don't want to go there because it's difficult, market is not that active, and it's hard to penetrate. So basically, from that perspective, getting to your point, like what are the trends and what are we looking at? So first, we are looking at different markets, and I didn't even get to Asia, right, which is completely different animal in that respect. So yeah, all of that affects the market, affects the consumers. What we see here, being in the AI Summit, is very different from what people in Germany see or people in Asia, like Singapore or China, see, right? So that they have significantly more advanced level of technology in many aspects.
Yeah.
So.
And then you were also, I think, kind of interested when we had the pre-call around the GDPR, kind of like the equation around that.
So GDPR, like, it was also part of the discussion on the main stage. So a few years ago, we had the GDPR conversations when Europe adopted a privacy law that was like very rigid for that time, and a lot of experts said, oh, it's almost impossible to follow. Like, and after that, the US followed that example, and basically now GDPR is kind of a golden standard for privacy and security regulation. And getting back to AI Act that the European Union enacted last year, I was initially thinking that it's going to be pretty much the same as the story with GDPR. Like one of my associates who is here, she went to London and spent summer in London to study that AI Act so we can implement for our clients. But the new administration came and said, we want to be first. And basically, at this point of time, I don't see that we're going to follow we're going to follow the example of European Union. I think we're going to do something like pretty much opposite to that. So that's why I don't think the GDPR story is applicable to AI regulation these days. Ben, what do you think?
Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I love that you brought it up because I was working with a lot of the large tech companies when they were in the sort of throes of implementing the responses that they needed to make in order to become GDPR compliant. All these companies, global companies, ones that were heavily invested in functioning well in all countries, including all these European countries. And so they had to get compliant with GDPR, and a lot of them sort of hit the snooze button, even though the EU was saying like, look, here's the date, GDPR is going to take effect, and everybody was like, oh, let's not worry about it. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, we have to worry about this. And it ended up costing these companies a lot of money to have to do it on a very short timeline, which is a big deal. And so I really thought like, okay, this is a perfect analogy. And I love that you sort of came into our previous meeting and like shattered my illusions around this, right? Like that really GDPR is going to be a lot different. Like our kind of cultural commitments around the way we want to be using AI in the United States are going to be different from what our expectations are around what the expectations are in the European context. And so, right, we see a lot of differences around how European users expect to have their data protected, right? They have a lot more sincere commitments to privacy, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I think in the United States, it's kind of like this almost expectation that like, okay, once we give our data to a social media company or something, like they're going to use it however they want.
Right.
And so I think what was great about that is that the EU was able to sort of take the lead on a higher level of privacy expectation. And what I'm hearing from you, and this comment really resonates, is that there is going to be such a high level of expectation around AI regulation in Europe. It's going to limit what sorts of systems will actually fly there. Like what are going to be actually allowed to be adopted based on Europeans' cultural expectation, right? Now, there's some interesting things that happened with the new White House executive order on AI, because frankly, when the Trump administration came in, they basically just removed the Biden administration statement, right? The Biden administration was working on a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and this executive order. Well, when that came down, I didn't expect to see another peep about this, right? It's like basically kind of, we just don't care about AI regulation. Well, then they recently published a new White House executive order, and there's a lot of similarities between it and the Biden White House executive order, but they added the phrase like, innovation first, like, right? We want to be leaders in AI innovation. And so it was like they sort of added several lines about how they want to make sure that whatever regulation we do implement in this country doesn't stifle innovation and ultimately our competitiveness with other nations that are building AI tools. That said, they did put quite a bit of emphasis on the idea of a high impact system. And in the EU AI Act, they talk a lot about high risk systems and the idea that there's going to be a higher expectation for governance around these systems. So that was an interesting piece. And then they did also say in the White House executive order that they were going to expect that there be governance practices that were structured around some of these high impact systems. So they are going to still ultimately want to see a paper trail, particularly for what high impact systems are, and how exactly we define that, I think, is not totally clear, but any systems that are using personally identifiable information, we have to be really critically careful about that. And anything where there could be a serious impact around fairness, and that's kind of come to mean a new thing under this administration.
Right.
But I think the idea is that we are still going to need to be measuring models for fairness of impact or equality of impact. And so that's a thing that we have to be thinking about carefully in this new world.
So would it be fair to say that the high impact areas would be like maybe finance, like loans, those sorts of things, healthcare, say?
I was going to say, I think any area where there's protected information, so HIPAA information, FERPA information for federal student records is going to be really important as well. So any area where we already have special laws around sensitive data, right? Employment records are going to be critically important here. So I think a lot of the tools that are being used by HR teams are also going to be something that we have to be very aware of. And that's already reflected in the NYC law around AI tools in hiring.
Got it. No, those are great points, the two of you. So switching back to the corporate governance side, a big concern from boards is really that they don't have the knowledge or insights to fully understand the risk of AI and what's involved. That said, they're also a very natural fear of missing out. Like we're going to miss out on the opportunities, we're going to miss out on all the benefits that AI can deliver. So good forward-looking boards are really seeing how ways that they can, one, identify the opportunities and then work with the management team to determine the trustworthiness of what's going to be implemented. So with that kind of forward view in mind and looking ahead, what do you two see in terms of how AI is going to be adopted, or maybe changes that will come up as AI becomes more widely adopted and moves from generative AI to agentic or autonomous AI? Are there anything that you can see or maybe have identified on with companies that are, say, further along in the adoption curve?
Yeah, I think the key thing that differentiates more mature companies from earlier stage companies is around their governance capacity. So I often describe, and this is an insight from my co-founder, Jake Metcalf, that AI trustworthiness is about culture and capacity, right? Culture is our values commitments. What have we done to actually say, like, here's the reality that we want to create with our technology? And then capacity is about the practices that we implement in order to realize our values commitments. So I think every company needs to be clear about what their values commitments are. That's like step one for every organization. What kind of tools are we building? What do we want to see? And what are our values as we deploy these tools and understand more about how they're going to impact our stakeholders? The capacity piece is really where we start to engage in governance. What sorts of review processes, what sorts of measurement and tracking processes are we engaging in to ensure that we have full and complete oversight over our AI tools to ensure that we can identify risks before they become harms, right? There's a phase between when we build a new AI product or we deploy a new model and when that actually starts to impact users. And so we always want to make sure before we deploy that we've engaged in the proper risk spotting practices in order to avoid those before they become harms.
And I would imagine that equally to have mechanisms in place if something's spotted that, there's a slippage or an adjustment there.
Exactly. I mean, often once you identify a risk, it's pretty easy to mitigate it, right? Like you tell your engineering team, here we have a risk of a negative impact based on the types of data that's being used. And so now we need to go and restructure the algorithm, right? Restructure the model. We need to either change the algorithm or its outputs, or we need to change the training data in order to make sure that we have more effective, diverse impacts.
Okay, and then Ben, you had also, when we were talking, provided a case study with the company Mednition.
Oh yeah, right.
Did you want to share that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mednition is a company I've been very impressed to be able to interview their founder, Christian Riley. And so what I learned from them is basically they have generated so much ROI from their responsible AI activities, right? What they've done is they have a team of 10 clinicians. The company builds in, among other things, sepsis models for hospital sepsis prediction models to determine whether or not a patient has sepsis, which is, I think, the number 1 or 2 most serious risk of death in hospitals, right? So being able to predict when someone has sepsis is incredibly valuable for lowering the death rate inside your hospital. Obviously, we want to do that, right? So Mednition has deployed this model called Kate Sepsis. They recently got breakthrough device designation from the FDA, which is a big deal, right? The FDA has said this is one of the most effective tools for predicting sepsis of any that are on the market.
Wow.
And so they have put so much investment into their responsible AI practices, and it's ultimately led to a model that actually works better than its competitors. How did they do this? Well, they have a team of 10 clinicians on their team, and every time they go to deploy this new iteration of the sepsis model, every one of these clinicians is able to weigh in, look at the new training data or the new model features that have gone into training the model, and each one of them has an individual veto. So if they say that they're uncomfortable with the functioning of this model for whatever reason, Mednition will not deploy that model.
Wow.
And basically they engage in a really careful conversation about ensuring that the impacts of these models are as positive as possible and that they're as accurate as possible, right? And so then also they understand the needs of their clients better, right? The people who are actually working in hospitals with these models, the clinicians and the caregivers, they understand their needs better because they're talking to these clinicians all the time. And so what this has meant is ultimately a better model that more people are adopting. They're getting better user retention and ultimately reduced user churn, because they have put so much effort into making this model the best it can be.
That's fantastic. And Svetlana, your perspective here, equally, I'm sure.
I like this example. So basically, this is a good example when founders invested money into building ethical product from the get-go, thinking about the future, and it brings trust of the clients, potential customers, and it makes it very easy for investors to invest into this product. I see different examples on both ends, implementation of AI in companies as well as development. Unfortunately, the way the market is built right now, basically founders need to deploy the product first, start generating the revenue, and if there is a product market fit, then they start thinking about how it impacts. And usually it doesn't happen at early stage. It's not pre-seed, the seed round. We get into round A. And what it means is that by that time, they have product, they have algorithm and data set, and it's not necessarily the case that you can change that easily, or it may be very expensive to change. So that's why we are advising our clients in terms of AI development and AI maturity to think kind of backwards, right? So what is going to happen if there is a product market fit? What kind of issues you're going to face? You're going to definitely explain your customers, your values, what kind of data you use, who owns the product, right? So how do you manage all that? And that will attract your clients as well as investors. So if you don't think about that from the get-go, it can be very easy or even detrimental for the company. That's in terms of development. And of course, like startup that develops has to have a lot of internal policies in order to protect the company. On the deployment and adoption of AI side, I think we face, and it's more to you, LouAnn, corporate, like board doesn't know a lot.
Right.
There is not enough information. Again, like if the board is in Silicon Valley, it's one story. If we're talking about another part of even US, it's a different story, different level of awareness of risks and exposure. And what I hear from different vendors that help companies to adopt AI now, companies want to automate and make efficient process without understanding what exactly it takes.
Right.
They don't understand that it's not necessarily just building the feature, but implementation and dealing with company and culture. So all of those parts are not taken into consideration when the board make initial decision about the deployment of some kind of feature or product,
Right.
etc. So there is a lot of work to be done in this field. And I think the first part is really education and understanding that whatever you do, you have to kind of think from the perspective of yourself 2 years later at least, and kind of try to think backwards.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
No,
that's
those are some great points. And I think kind of going back to what you said about education, I think it's one of the critical concerns for not only for the boards and for the companies. Deloitte just came out with a survey for private companies, and they said the top three risks that they saw are challenges that they had was identifying AI use cases, followed by training and upskilling for their employees, and then the third one was ensuring that their boards had the training that they need to do the proper governance. So it's definitely top of mind for many, many people. With that, I would just point out, kind of looking ahead in the future with respect to corporate governance, that even the AI is going to change the way that boards run their work, with AI coming directly into the boardroom. And so historically, the way it's been done now is a lot of this information is very asymmetrical. It's coming from management, and so it's delivered from the management team to the board director, and so it's coming in one-sided. Going forward, they're going to have access to information from all sides. So not only I think the volume is going to increase, but the frequency in which they get the information is going to be increased, as opposed to those quarterly or however the frequency is of the board meetings. And so that's going to change. And additionally, I'm going to say it's going to be a bit of a head swivel. So it's going to go from looking at very reactive, all the information from the past, to being much more predictive and being able to really take in trend analysis, which I think will just uplift the output and the quality of the outcomes with the board working collaboratively with the management team there. So I think that's, to me, is what I see going ahead really from a board working perspective, at least in the near term. Do you two have any other thoughts or ideas with what you see from where your purview is that maybe we haven't touched on that you would like to raise now?
Sure. So with respect to the board question, I think you're right that there's going to be a lot more access to real-time insight when it comes to the functioning of an AI company's model. We're starting to see a lot of tools that make it easier to monitor the performance of an AI model in real time. And so now if a board wants to be able to have real-time oversight around the functioning of their team's models, right? I mean, I know no board wants to be too invasive, but at the same time, we really want to have that capacity for sort of almost real-time guidance when it comes to these things, and being able to provide insight and have board members be able to see a dashboard that like really looks at the model performance in real time, I think is going to be a very powerful tool for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I just want to say a few words for startups that develop AI technology, right? So there are layers that they have to tackle, and we have to start from geopolitical level probably, because we cannot separate technology development from politics these days. So depending what is a target market and what are they developing, if it's strategic technology, what kind of data set they want to manage, they have to cover that first. Then it comes to ethics and thinking through the process, like how that should be addressed, because that eventually brings you investors and customers.
Exactly.
And then going into the lower level of like policies, procedures, and protecting of your intellectual property. If you start from low level, it can be very difficult to change something like on a higher level. And that's what I mentioned before. So you have to really go up.
Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you start as a lot
it's like a reverse, you know?
Absolutely.
You have to survive first, yes. But to survive, you have to understand if you even can bring this product to the market.
Right.
Because
well, and it's like, I think that's such a good insight, right? That it's like we want to build a foundation for growth, but we want to build a foundation for sustainable growth.
Yes.
Right? If we end up building a product that is problematic in some way, or we structure our business model in a way that's not sustainable, we can end up having to put millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars into that pivot down the line, right? We've acquired a whole bunch of different users, and now we find out there's some sort of responsible AI or ethical concern that is emergent within our product or business model. Those pivots can be devastatingly expensive.
Well, I would just add that I think one of the big risks that we haven't really talked about was around reputation. So if you don't factor that in, then it's game over. It doesn't matter once you've ruined the reputation. I think that's a concern with a lot of customers.
Yeah, reputational risk is existential risk.
Absolutely. Well, thank you two both so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, LouAnn. It was great. Great to talk to you, and great insights from you, Svetlana. Thanks.